Can you confirm if you can hear to me? Well,
Yes, Prabhuji, I can hear.
clear?
Yes, for me it's okay.
Okay. Hare Krishna. Om Jnana-timirandhasya Jnana-salakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Karamahim Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yutapakamalan Shri Guru Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahakana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishaka Anvitamscha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namne Namaste Naradeva Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Pachatadisani Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktarunda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare. Reading from Śrīla Prabhupāda-līlāmṛta, Volume 1, Chapter 11, The Dream Come True. I planned that I must go to America. Generally they go to London, but I did not want to go to London. I was simply thinking how to go to New York. I was scheming whether I shall go this way through Tokyo, Japan, or that way, which was cheaper. That was my proposal, and I was targeting to New York always. Sometimes I was dreaming that I have come to New York. Srila Prabhupada. Writing was only half the battle, the other half was publishing. Both Bhaktivedanta Swami and his spiritual master wanted to see Srimad Bhagavatam printed in English and distributed widely. According to the teachings of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, the most modern methods of printing and distributing books should be used to spread Krishna consciousness. Although many books of Vaishnava wisdom had already been perfectly presented by Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami and Jiva Goswami, the manuscripts now sat deteriorating in Radha Damodar temple and other locations, and even the Gaudiya Math's printings of the Goswami's work were not being widely distributed. One of the Bhaktivedanta Swami's god brothers asked him why he was spending so much time and effort trying to make a new commentary on Bhagavatam, since so many great acharyas had already commented upon it. But in Bhaktivedanta Swami's mind there was no question. His spiritual master had given him an order. Commercial publishers, however, were not interested in 60-volume Bhagavatam series, and Bhaktivedanta Swami was not interested in anything less than a 60-volume Parampara presentation of verses, synonyms and purports based on the commentaries of the previous acharyas. But to publish such books, he would have to raise private donations and publish at his own expenses. Radha Damodar temple may have been at the best place for writing Srimad Bhagavatam, but not for printing and publishing it. For that, he would have to go to New Delhi. Among his Delhi contacts, Bhaktivedanta Swami considered Hitsaran Sharma a likely helper. Although when he had stayed in Mr. Sharma's home, Mr. Sharma had appreciated him more as a member of a Gyan than as an individual, at least Mr. Sharma was inclined to help sadhus, and he recognized Bhaktivedanta Swami as a genuinely religious person. Therefore, when Bhaktivedanta Swami approached him in his office, he was willing to help, considering it a religious duty to propagate Srimad Bhagavatam. Hitsaran Sharma was qualified to help for two reasons. He was the secretary of J.D. Dalmia, a wealthy philanthropist, and he was the owner of a commercial printing works, Radha Press. According to Mr. Sharma, Mr. Dalmia would not directly give money to Bhaktivedanta Swami, even if his secretary suggested it. Mr. Sharma therefore advised Bhaktivedanta Swami to go to Gorakhpur and show his manuscript to Hanuman Prasad Poddar, a religious publisher. Accepting this as a good advice, Bhaktivedanta Swami journeyed to Gorakhpur, some 475 miles from New Delhi. Even such a trip as this constituted a financial strain. Bhaktivedanta Swami's daily ledger showed a balance of 130 rupees as of August 8, 1962, the day he started for Gorakhpur. By the time he reached Lucknow, he was down to 57 rupees. Travel from Lucknow to Gorakhpur cost another 6 rupees, and the rickshaw to Mr. Poddar's home cost 80 paisa. But the trip was well worth the cost. Bhaktivedanta Swami presented Mr. Poddar with his letter of introduction from Hiksharan Sharma and then showed him his manuscript. After briefly examining the manuscript, Mr. Poddar concluded it to be a highly developed work that should be supported. He agreed to send a donation of 4,000 rupees to the Dalmia Trust in Delhi to be used towards the publication of Sri A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami's Srimad Bhagavatam. Indian printers do not always require full payment before they begin a job, provided they receive a substantial advance payment. After the job is printed and bound, a customer who has not made a complete payment takes a portion of the books commensurate to what he has paid, and after selling those books, he uses his profit to buy more. Bhaktivedanta Swami estimated that the printing one volume would cost 7,000 rupees, so he was 3,000 short. He raised a few hundred rupees more by going door to door throughout Delhi. Then he went back to Radha Press and asked Hitsaran Sharma to begin. Mr. Sharma agreed. Radha Press had already produced much of the first two chapters where Bhaktivedanta Swami objected that the type was not large enough. He wanted 12-point type, but the Radha Press had only 10-point. So Mr. Sharma agreed to take the work to another printer, Mr. Gautam Sharma of OK Press. In printing Bhaktivedanta Swami's Volume 1 of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, OK Press printed 4 books, pages twice on a side of one sheet of paper 20 by 26 inches. But before running the full 1100 copies, they would print a proof which Bhaktivedanta Swami would read. Then, following the corrected proofs, the printers would correct the handset type and run a second proof, which Bhaktivedanta would also read. Usually, he would also find errors on second proof. If so, they would print a third. If he found no errors on the third proof, they would then print the final pages. At this pace, Bhaktivedanta Swami was able to order small quantities of paper as he would afford it, from 6 to 10 reams at a time, ordered 2 weeks in advance. Even as the volume was being printed, he was still writing the last chapters. When the proofs were ready by Mr. OK Press, he would pick up the proof, return to his room at Chippywada, correct the proofs, and then return them. Sometimes 14-year-old Kantveri, who lived at Chippywada temple with his parents, would carry the proofs back and forth for the Swami. But in the last months of 1962, Bhaktivedanta Swami usually made a daily walk to OK Press. His walk through the tight, crowded lane of Chippywada soon led him to a road cross to the Jama Mosque, and then road led into the noisy, heavily trafficked Chowri Bazaar. The neighborhood was a busy paper district where laborers with ropes strapped across their shoulders pulled stout wooden carts, heavily loaded with the stacks of paper on small iron wheels. For 2 blocks, paper dealers were the only businesses. Hari Ram Gupta and Company, Roop Chand and Sons, Bengal Paper Mill Company Limited, Universal Traders, Janta Paper Mart, one after another, even down the side alleys. The neighborhood storefronts were colorful and disorderly. Pedestrian traffic was so hectic that for a person to dally even for a moment would cause a disruption. Carts and rickshaws carried paper and other goods back and forth through the streets. Sometimes a laborer would jog past with a hefty stack of papers on his head, the stack weighing down on either end. Traffic was swift, and unmindful or slow-footed pedestrian risked being struck by a load protruding from the head of a barrier or from a passing cart. Occasionally, a man would be squatting on the roadside, smashing chunks of coal into small pieces to sell. Tiny corner smoke shops drew small gatherings of customers for cigarettes or pan. The shopkeepers would rapidly spread the pan spices on a betel leaf, and the customer would walk off down the street chewing the pan and spitting out red-stained saliva. Amid this milieu, as the Chavri Bazaar commercial district blended into tenement life and children played in hazardous streets, Bhaktivedanta Swami was a gentle-looking yet determined figure. As he walked past the tenements, the tile sellers, the grain sellers, the sweet shops, and present printers, overheard overhead would be electric wires, pigeons, and cloth lines from the tenement balconies. Finally, he would come to OK Press directly across from a small mosque. He would come carrying the corrected proofs to anxiously oversee the printing work. After 4 months, when the whole book had been printed and the sheets were stacked on the floor of press, Mr. Hit Sharan Sharma arranged for the work to be moved to a bindery. The binding was done by an ancient operation, mostly by hand, and it took another month. Bhaktivedanta Swami would come and observe the workers. The binding was done by an ancient operator. The first man would take one of the large printed sheets, rapidly fold it twice, and pass it to the next man, who performed the next operation. The pages would be folded, stitched, and collated, then put into a vise and hammered together before being trimmed on three sides with a hand saw and glued. Bit by bit, the book would be prepared for the final hard copy. In addition to his visits to OK Press and the bindery, Bhaktivedanta Swami would also occasionally travel by bus across the Yamuna River to Mr. Hit Sharan Sharma's Radha Press. The Radha Press was printing 1,000 dust jackets for the volume. Hit Sharan Sharma. Swamiji was going hither and thither. He was getting whatever collections he could and depositing them. And he was always mixing with many people, going hither and thither. With me, he was very fond that I should do everything as soon as possible. He had a great haste. He used to say, time is going, quick, do it. He would be annoyed with me also, and he would also have me to do this work first. But I was in the service of Dalmia and would tell him, your work has to be secondary for me. But he would say, now you have wasted my 2 days. What is this, Sharmaji? I am coming here. I told you in the morning to do this, and you have not done it even now. But I would reply, I have got no time during the day. Then he would say, then you have wasted my complete day. So he was very much pressing me. This was his temperament. The binding was reddish, the color of an earthen brick, and was inlaid with golden lettering. Bhaktivedanta Swami had designed the dust jacket himself, and he had commissioned a young Bengali artist named Salit to execute it. It was a wrap around a picture of entire spiritual and material manifestations. Dominating the front cover was a pink lotus, and within its whole were Radha and Krishna and their pastimes in Vrindavan, along with Lord Chaitanya chanting and dancing with his associates. From Krishna's lotus planet emanated yellow rays of light, and in that effulgence were many spiritual planets, appearing like so many suns. Sitting within each planet was a different four-armed form of Narayan, each with his name lettered beneath the planet, Trivikrama, Keshava, Purushottama, and so on. Within an oval at the bottom of the front cover, Mahavishnu was exhaling the material universes. On the inside cover was Bhaktivedanta Swami's explanation of cover illustration. When the printing and binding were completed, there were 1100 copies. Bhaktivedanta Swami would receive 100 copies, and the printer would keep the balance. From the sale of 100 copies, Bhaktivedanta Swami would continue to pay off his debt to the printer and binder. Then he would receive another supply of books. This would continue until he has finished paying his debt. His plan was then publish a second volume from the profits of the first and the third volume from the profits of the second. Kantweri went to pick up the first 100 copies. He hired a man who put the books in large baskets, placed them on his hand truck, and then hauled them through the streets of Chippivada temple, where Bhaktivedanta Swami stacked them in his room on a bench. Bhaktivedanta Swami went out alone to sell his books and present them to important person Dr. Radhakrishnan, who gave him a personal audience, agreed to read the book and write his opinion. Hanuman Prasad Poddar was the first to write a favorable review. It is a source of great pleasure for me that a long cherished dream has materialized and is going to be materialized with this and the would be publications. I thank the Lord that due to His grace this publication could see the light. Bhaktivedanta Swami went to the major libraries, universities, and schools in Delhi, where the librarians found him calm and quiet, noble, polite, scholarly, with a specific glow in him. Traveling on foot, he visited school administration offices throughout Delhi and placed copies in more than 40 schools in the Delhi area. The Ministry of Education, which had previously denied his assistance, placed an order for 50 copies for selected university and institutional libraries throughout India. The ministry paid him 600 rupees plus packing and postage charges, and Bhaktivedanta Swami mailed the books to the designated libraries. The US Embassy purchased 18 copies to be distributed in America through the Library of Congress. The institutional sales were brisk, but then sales slowed. As the only agent, Bhaktivedanta Swami was now spending hours just to sell a few copies. He was eager to print the second volume, yet until enough money came from the first, he could not print. In the meanwhile, he continued translating and writing purports. Writing so many volumes was a huge task that would take many years, and at this present rate, with sales so slow, he would not be able to complete the work in his lifetime. Although there were many who took part in the production of the book and still book authors who became customers, only Bhaktivedanta Swami deeply experienced the successes and failures of the venture. It was his project and he was responsible. No one was eager to see him writing prolifically, and no one demanded that it to be printed. Even when the sales slowed to a trickle, the managers of OK Press were not distressed. They would give him the balance of his books only when he paid for them. And since it was also he who had the burden of hiring OK Press to print a second volume, the pressure was on him to go out and sell as many copies of the first volume as possible. For Hanuman Prasad Poddar, the volume had been something to admire in passing. For Hitsharan Sharma, it had been something he had tended to after his day's work for Mr. Dalmia. For the boy who lived at Chippivada, the book had meant a few errands. For the paper dealers, it had meant a small order. For Dr. Radhakrishnan, it had been but the slightest, soon forgotten matter in a life crammed with national politics and Hindu philosophizing. But Bhaktivedanta Swami, by his full engagement in producing Bhagavatam, felt bliss and assurance that Krishna was pleased. He did not, however, intend for Bhagavatam to be his private affair. It was a sorely needed medicine for the ills of Kali Yuga. It was also possible for only one man to administer it, yet he was alone, and he felt exclusive pleasure and satisfaction in serving his Guru and Lord Krishna. Thus his transcendental frustration and pleasure mingled, his will strengthened, and he continued alone. His spiritual master, the previous spiritual masters, and Vedic scriptures all assured him that he was right. If a person got a copy of the Bhagavatam and read even one page, he would decide to take part in Lord Chaitanya's movement. If a person seriously read the book, he would be convinced about spiritual life. The more this book could be distributed, the more the people could understand Krishna consciousness. And if they understand Krishna consciousness, they would become liberated from all problems. Book selling was real preaching. Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati had wanted it, even at the neglect of constructing temples or making followers. Who could preach as well as Srimad Bhagavatam? Certainly no one spent 16 rupees for a book would also take the time at least to look at it. In the months that followed, Bhakti Vedanta Swami received more favorable reviews. The prestigious Adayar Library Bulletin gave a full review noting the editor's vast and deep study of the subject and concluding further volumes of this publication are eagerly awaited. His scholarly godbrothers also wrote their appreciations. Swami Bon Maharaj, rector of the Institute of Oriental Philosophy in Vrindavan, wrote, I have nothing but admiration for your bold and practical venture. If you should be able to complete the whole work, you will render a very great service to the cause of Prabhupada Sri Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and the country also. Do it, and rest assured there will be no scarcity of resources. Bhakti Saranga Maharaj wrote a full review in his Sajjana Toshani. We expect that this particular English version of Srimad Bhagavatam will be widely read and thereby spiritual poverty of people in general may be removed forever. At a time when we need it very greatly, Srimad Bhaktivedanta Swami has given us the right thing. We recommend this publication for everyone's serious study. Sri Bishwanath Das, Governor of Uttar Pradesh, commented the volume to all thoughtful people, and Economic Review praised the author for attempting a tremendous task. At a time when not only the people of India but those of West need the chastening quality of love and truth in corrupting atmosphere of hate and hypocrisy, a work like this will have uplifting and corrective influence. Dr. Zakir Hussain, Vice President of India, wrote, I have read your book Srimad Bhagavatam with great interest and much profit. I thank you again for the kind thought which must have prompted you to present it to me. The favorable reviews. Although Bhaktivedanta Swami could not pay the printer with them, indicated a serious response. The book was valuable, and subsequent volumes would earn the series even more respect. By Krishna's grace, Bhaktivedanta Swami had already completed many of the translations and purports for volume 2. Even in the last weeks of printing the first volume, he had been writing day and night for the second volume. It was glorification of Supreme Lord Krishna, therefore it would require many volumes. He felt impelled to praise Krishna and describe him in more and more volumes. Śrīla Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had said that the presses of the world could not print fast enough the glories of Krishna and the spiritual world that were being received at every moment by pure devotees. Bhaktivedanta Swami decided to return to Vrindavan for several months of intensive writing on volume 2. This was his real business at Radha Damodar temple. Vrindavan was the best place for writing transcendental literature. That had already been demonstrated by the Vaishnava Acharyas of the past. Living in simple ease, taking little rest and food, he continually translated the verses and composed his Bhaktivedanta purport for volume 2. After a few months, after amassing enough manuscript pages, he would return to Delhi and once again enter the world of publishing. In volume 1, he had covered the first 6.5 chapters of the first canto. The second volume began on page 365 with 8th verse of the 7th chapter. Bhaktivedanta Swami wrote in his purport that Srimad Bhagavatam was meant for Paramahamsas, persons engaged purely in self-realization. Yet he wrote, it works into the depth of the heart of those who may be worldly men. Worldly men are all engaged in the matter of sense gratification, but even such a man also will find in this Vedic literature a remedial medicine for their material diseases. Bhaktivedanta Swami returned to Delhi to raise funds for printing volume 2. When he visited a prospective donor, he would show the man volume 1 and the growing collection of reviews, explaining that he was asking a donation not to support himself but to print this important literature. Although for the first volume he had received no donations equal to the 4,000 rupees he had received from Mr. Poddar. An executive in the L&H sugar factory gave a donation of 5,000 rupees for volume 2. Bhaktivedanta Swami had been dissatisfied with Hit Sharan Sharma as a production supervisor. Although supposedly an expert in trade, Hit Sharan Sharma had caused delays, and sometimes he had advised Gautam Sharma without consulting Bhaktivedanta Swami. The work on volume 1 had slowed and even stopped when a job from a cash customer had come up, and Bhaktivedanta Swami had complained that it was Hit Sharan's fault for not giving money to OK Press on time. For volume 2, Bhaktivedanta Swami decided to directly deal with OK Press and supervise the printing himself. He spoke to Gautam Sharma and offered a partial payment. Although the majority of the copies of volume 1 were still standing on the printing floor, Bhaktivedanta Swami wanted OK Press to begin volume 2. Gautam Sharma accepted the job. It was early in 1964 when volume 2 went to press, following the same steps as volume 1, but this time Bhaktivedanta Swami was more actively present, pushing. To avoid delays, he purchased the paper himself at Sidhu and Sons paper merchants in the heart of paper district. He would choose and order his paper and then arrange to transport it to OK Press. If the order was a large one, he would have it carried by cart. Some small orders he would send by rickshaw or on the head of a barrier. In his preface to the second volume, Bhaktivedanta Swami expressed the apparent oddity of working in Delhi while living in Vrindavan. The path of fruitive activities, that is to say, the path of earn money and enjoy life, as it is going on generally, appears to have become also our profession, although we have renounced the order of worldly life. They see that we are moving in the cities, in the government offices, banks, and other business places for promoting the publication of Srimad Bhagavatam. They also see that we are moving in the press, paper market, and amongst the book binders, also away from our residence at Vrindavan, and thus they conclude sometimes mistakenly that we are also doing the same business in the dress of a mendicant. But actually, there is a gulf of difference between the two kinds of activities. This is not a business for maintaining an establishment of material enjoyment. On the contrary, it is a humble attempt to broadcast the glories of Lord at a time when the people need it very badly. He went on to describe how in former days, even 50 years ago, well-to-do members of society had commissioned pandits to print or handwrite the Bhagavatam and then distribute copies amongst the devotees and the general people. But times had changed. At the present moment, the time is so changed that we had to request one of the biggest industrialists of India to purchase 100 copies and distribute them, but the poor fellow expressed his inability. We wished that somebody may come forward to pay for the actual cost of publication of this Srimad Bhagavatam and let them be distributed free to all the leading gentlemen of the world. But nobody is so far prepared to do this social uplifting work. After thanking the Ministry of Education and Director of Education for distributing copies to institutions' libraries, Bhaktivedanta Swami again stated his predicament before his reading public. The problem is that we must get some money for completing the work, which is admittedly a mighty project. The sales proceeds are being employed in the promotional work and not in sense gratification. Herein lies the difference between the fruitive activities. And for all this, we have to approach everyone concerned just like a businessman. There is no harm to become a businessman if it is done on an account of Lord, as much as there was no harm to become a violent warrior like Arjuna or Hanumanji if some belligerent activities are executed to satisfy the desires of the Supreme Lord. So even though we are not in the Himalayas, even though we talk of business, even though we deal in rupees and paisa, still, simply because we are 100% servants of the Lord and are engaged in the service of broadcasting the message of His glories, certainly we shall transcend and get through the invincible impasse of Maya and reach the effulgent kingdom of God to render him face to face eternal service in full bliss and knowledge. We are confident of this factual position, and we may also assure to our numerous readers that they will also achieve the same result simply by hearing the glories of the Lord. On receipt of the first copies of the second volume, another 400 pages cloth-bound, brick-colored Srimad Bhagavatam with the same dust jacket as volume 1, Bhaktivedanta Swami made the round of the institutions, scholars, politicians and booksellers. One Delhi bookseller, Dr. Manohar Lal Jain, had particular success in selling the volumes. Manohar Lal Jain. He would come to me for selling his books. He would come often, and he used to chat with me for 1 or 2 hours. He had no other business except selling his books as much as possible. He would discuss the difficulties he was having and also many other things, yoga, Vedanta, and religious aspects of life. His problem was distributing his work because it was a big publication. He had planned to publish it in many volumes. Naturally, I told him it was not possible for any individual bookseller or publisher here to publish it and invest money in it. So that was a little bit of a disappointment for him because he could not bring out more volumes. But my sales were good because this was the best translation, Sanskrit text with English translations. No other such edition was available. I sold about 150 to 200 copies in about 2 or 3 years. The price was very little, only 16 rupees. He had published his reviews and he had a good sell, a good market. The price was reasonable and he was not interested in making money out of it. He was printing in English for the foreigners. He had a good command of Sanskrit as well as English. When we met, we would speak in English and his English was very impressive. He wanted me to publish, but I didn't have any presses and no finances. I told him frankly I would not be able to publish it because it was not 1 or 2 volumes but many, but he managed anyhow. I referred him to Atmaram and Sons. He also used to go there. He was a great master, a philosopher, a great scholar. I used to enjoy the talks. He used to sit with me for 1 or 2 hours as much as he could afford. Sometimes he would come in the morning, 11 or 12, then sometimes in the afternoon. He used to come in for money. How many copies are sold? So I would pay him. Practically, he was not doing very well with finances at that time. He only wanted that his books should be sold to every library and everywhere where the people are interested in it. We used to publish a catalog every month, and I would advertise his book. Orders would be coming from all over the world. So at least for me, the sales were picking up. If I sold 100 copies of first volume, then I figured the second volume would be sold in the same number naturally. But definitely, those who would take the first volume would also take volume 2 because it was institutional and institutions will always try to complete their set. He used to discuss with me how the volumes can be brought out and how many it would take to complete the Srimad Bhagavatam. He was very much interested in bringing out the whole series. In Jan of 1964, Bhaktivedanta Swami was granted an interview with Indian Vice President Zakir Hussain, who, although a Muslim, had written an appreciation of Bhaktivedanta Swami's Srimad Bhagavatam. As Dr. Hussain cordially received the author at a presidential palace, Bhaktivedanta Swami spoke of the importance of Srimad Bhagavatam in the cause of love of Godhead. But Dr. Hussain wanted to know how love of Godhead could help humanity. The question put by ruler to sadhu was filled with philosophical implications, but the vice president's busy schedule of meeting did not permit Bhaktivedanta Swami to answer fully. For the vice president, the interview was a gesture of appreciation, recognizing the Swami for his work on behalf of India's Hindu cultural heritage, and Bhaktivedanta Swami humbly accepted the ritual. Later, however, he wrote Dr. Hussain a long letter answering the question he had not had time to answer during their brief meeting. Muslims also admit, he wrote, that there is nothing greater than Allah. The Christians also admit that God is great. The human society must learn to obey the laws of God. He reminded Dr. Hussain of India's great cultural asset, the Vedic literature. The Indian government should perform the best welfare work for humanity by disseminating the Vedic knowledge in systematic way. Srimad Bhagavatam was produced in India. It was a substantial contribution India could offer to the world. In March of 1964, Krishna Pandit Bhaktivedanta Swami's sponsor at Radha Krishna Temple in Chippiwada arranged for him to reside for a few months at Sri Radha Vallabhji Temple in nearby Rosanpura, Naisarak neighborhood. There he could continue his writing and publishing, but he would also be giving a series of lectures. Krishna Pandit provided Bhaktivedanta Swami about 1500 rupees for his maintenance. On Bhaktivedanta Swami's arrival at Sri Radha Vallabhaji Temple, the manager distributed notices inviting people to take full advantage of the presence of a Vaishnava sadhu as resident Acharya. Bhaktivedanta Swami held morning and evening discourses at the temple without reducing his activities of writing and printing. In June, Bhaktivedanta Swami got the opportunity to meet Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri. The meeting had been arranged by Doladram Kanna, a wealthy jeweler who was a trustee of Chippiwada Temple and had often met with Bhaktivedanta Swami there. An old friend of Prime Minister Shastri's since his youth, when they had attended the same yoga club, Mr. Kanna arranged the meeting as a favor to Bhaktivedanta Swami. Let the Prime Minister meet a genuine sadhu, Mr. Kanna thought. It was a formal occasion in the garden of Parliament building and the Prime Minister was meeting a number of guests. Prime Minister Shastri, dressed in white kurta and dhoti and Nehru hat and surrounded by aides, received the elderly sadhu. Bhaktivedanta Swami, looking scholarly in his spectacles, stepped forward and introduced himself and his book Srimad Bhagavatam. As he handed the Prime Minister a copy of Volume 1, the photographer snapped a photo of the author and the Prime Minister smiling over the book. The next day, Bhaktivedanta Swami wrote to Prime Minister Shastri. He soon received a reply, personally signed by the Prime Minister. Dear Swamiji, many thanks for your letter. I am indeed grateful to you for presenting a copy of Srimad Bhagavatam to me. I do realize that you are doing valuable work. It would be a good idea if the libraries in the government institutions purchase copies of this book. Bhaktivedanta Swami wrote back to the Prime Minister requesting him to buy books for Indian institutions. Mr. R.K. Sharma of the Ministry of Education subsequently wrote back confirming that they would take 50 copies of Volume 2 just as they had taken Volume 1. To concentrate on completing Volume 3, Bhaktivedanta Swami returned to Radha Damodar Temple. These were the last days of the first canto dealing with the advent of the present age of Kali. There were many verses foretelling society's degradation and narrating how the great king Parikshit had starved of Kali's influence by his strong Krishna-conscious rule. In his purports, Bhaktivedanta Swami wrote that government would not check corruption unless it rooted out the four basic principles of religion: meat eating, illicit sex, intoxication, and gambling. You cannot check all these evils of society simply by statutory acts of police vigilance, but you have to cure the disease of mind by the proper medicine, namely advocating the principles of Brahmanical culture or the principles of austerity, cleanliness, mercy, and truthfulness. We must always remember that false undue attachment for women or association with them and intoxicating habits of all description will cripple the human civilization from the path of factual peace. However, the people may go on clamoring for such peace of the world. To raise funds for Volume 3, Bhaktivedanta Swami decided to try Bombay. He travelled there in July and stayed at Prem Kutir Dharmashala, a free ashram. Srila Prabhupada. At Prema Kutir, they received me very nicely. I was going to sell my books. Some of them were criticizing, what kind of sannyasi? He is making business book selling. Not the authorities said this, but some of them. I was writing my book then also. Then I became a guest of 15 days with a member of the Almia family. One of the brothers told me that he wanted to construct a large cottage at his house. You can live here, I will give you a nice cottage. I thought, no, it is not good to be fully dependent on patronized by a Vasai, a materialist. But I stayed for 15 days and he gave me exclusive use of a typewriter for writing my books. Bhaktivedanta Swami made his rounds of the institutions and booksellers in the Mumbai. He now had an advertisement showing himself with Prime Minister Shastri, and he also had the Prime Minister's letter and Ministry of Education's purchase order for 50 volumes. Still, he was getting only small orders. Then he decided to visit Sumati Morarji, head of Scindia Steamship Company. He had heard from his godbrothers in Bombay that she was known for helping sadhus and had donated to the Bombay Gaudiya Mutt. He had never met her, but he well remembered the 1958 promise by one of her officers to arrange half-fare passage for him to America. Now he wanted her help for printing Srimad Bhagavatam. But his first attempts to arrange a meeting were unsuccessful. Frustrated at being put off by Mrs. Morarji's officers, he sat down on the front steps of her office building, determined to catch her attention as she left for the day. The lone sadhu certainly caused some attention as he sat quietly chanting for 5 hours on the steps of Scindia Steamship Company building. Finally, late that afternoon, Mrs. Morarji is emerging in a flurry of business talk with her secretary, Mr. Chokshi. Upon seeing Bhaktivedanta Swami, she stopped. Who is this gentleman sitting here? She asked Mr. Chokshi. He's been here for 5 hours, the secretary said. All right, I'll come, she said and walked up to where Bhaktivedanta Swami was sitting. He smiled and stood, offered namaskars with his folded palms. Swamiji, what can I do for you? She said. Bhaktivedanta Swami told her briefly of his intentions to print the third volume of his Srimad Bhagavatam. I want you to help me, he said. All right, Mrs. Morarji replied. We can meet tomorrow because it is getting late. Tomorrow you can come and we will discuss. The next day, Bhaktivedanta Swami met with Mrs. Morarji in her office, where she looked at the typed manuscript and published volumes. All right, she said. If you want to print it, I will give you the aid. Whatever you want, you can get it printed. With Mrs. Morarji's guarantee, Bhaktivedanta Swami was free to return to Vrindavan to finish writing the manuscript. As with the previous volumes, he set a demanding schedule for writing and publishing. The third volume would complete the first canto. Then, with a supply of impressive literature, he would be ready to go to the West. Even with volume 1 and 2, he was getting a better reception in India. Already he had seen the Vice President and Prime Minister. He had successfully approached a big business magnate of Bombay, and within a few months of presenting the book, he had received a large donation. The books were powerful preaching. Janmashtami was drawing near, and Bhaktivedanta Swami was planning a celebration at Radha Damodar temple. He wanted to invite Vishwanath Das, the governor of Uttar Pradesh, to preside over the ceremony honoring Lord Krishna's appearance. Sri Vishwanath had received a copy of Srimad Bhagavatam Volume 1 and had written a favorable review. Although a politician, he was known for his affection and respect for sadhus. He regularly invited recognized sadhus to his home, and once a year he would visit all the important temples of Mathura and Vrindavan. Bhaktivedanta Swami asked Vrindavan's municipal president Mangalal Sharma to invite the governor to the Janmashtami celebration at Radha Damodar temple. The governor readily accepted the invitation. Bhaktivedanta Swami printed a flyer announcing, on the occasion of Janmashtami's ceremony at the Samadhi ground of Sri Rupa and Jiva Goswami, Sri Radha Damodar temple, Seva Kunj, Vrindavan. Gaudiya Kirtan performances in the presence of His Excellency Sri Vishwanath Das, Governor of Uttar Pradesh, and Chief Guest Sri G.D. Somani of Bombay, Trustee of Sri Ranganathji Temple, Vrindavan, dated at Vrindavan, Sunday, the 31st August 1964 at 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. The flyer contained an advertisement for the Srimad Bhagavatam series to be completed in 60 volumes. Bhajans to be sung on the occasion: Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu, Nitaya Padakamal. The prayers to the six Goswamis and favorite songs of Gaudiya Vaishnavas were printed in Bengali as a songbook. The program was successful. A large crowd attended and sang songs to Lord Krishna and took prasadam. Bhaktivedanta Swami lectured on a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam describing the age of Kali as an ocean of faults that had but one saving quality, the chanting of Hare Krishna. After leading Hare Krishna Kirtan, Bhaktivedanta Swami presented a copy of his second volume of Srimad Bhagavatam to the governor and spoke of his plans to preach all over the world. The day after Janmashtami was Bhaktivedanta Swami's 69th birthday. A few days later, Vishwanath Das requested Swami Maharaj to visit him at his mansion in Lucknow. It was a special occasion, and the governor had invited several sadhus and planned a kirtan program. He had invited a professional musical group who toured India performing kirtans and giving recitals. One of the musicians, young Sisir Kumar Bhattacharya, was very impressed with Bhaktivedanta Swami. Sisir Bhattacharya: we were invited to perform kirtan in the governor's house in Lucknow. We had about 7 or 8 in our group. This was the governor's house and a big home, and was sitting on a dais. I saw the governor, Vishwanath Das, and beside him was a sadhu who was old but I thought was really strong. When I saw the governor sitting there, I came down from the dais and bowed down. Then I asked which subject he wanted to listen to. He said, "Let's have something about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu." Then I said, "I am very glad you selected this." About 1.5 hours we spent on Mahaprabhu's Kirtan, and then we had our dinner in big banquet hall, and all on silver plates with governor's symbols on each of them. We sat together, and I was sitting side by side with the same sadhu, and he introduced himself as Bhaktivedanta Swami. We discussed, and then the Swami presented me with a book, Srimad Bhagavatam. Bhaktivedanta Swami said, "I am interested to propagate Krishna Rama and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the Western countries. I am trying to get some way to find some ticket. If I get, I will go, and I will propagate Mahaprabhu's teachings." And he uttered this verse from Mahaprabhu: "Prithivite acheyata nagaradi gram sarvatra prachare haibe mora nam." But I did not think he would actually be able to do it because he was very simple and poor. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had predicted, "One day my name will be known in every town and village in the world." With the manuscript for volume 3 complete and with the money to print it, Bhaktivedanta Swami once again entered the printing world, purchasing paper, correcting proofs, and keeping the printer on schedule so that the book would be finished by Jan 1965. Thus, by his persistence, he who had almost no money for his own managed to publish his third large hardbound volume 3 within a little more than 2 years. At this rate, with his respect in the scholarly world increasing, he might soon become a recognized figure amongst his countrymen. But he had his vision set on the West, and with the third volume now printed, he felt he was at last prepared. He was 69 and would have to go soon. He had been more than 40 years since Śrīla Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had first asked a young householder in Calcutta to preach Krishna consciousness in the West. At first it had seemed impossible to Abhay Charan, who had so recently entered family responsibilities. That obstacle, however, had long ago been removed, and for more than 10 years he had been free to travel, but he had been penniless and still was, and he had wanted first to publish some volumes of Srimad Bhagavatam to take with him. It had seemed necessary if he were to do something solid. Now, by Krishna's grace, 3 volumes were on hand. Srila Prabhupada said, I planned that I must go to America. Generally, they go to London, but I did not want to go to London. I was simply thinking how to go to New York. I was scheming whether I shall go this way through Tokyo, Japan, or that way. Which way is cheaper? That was my proposal, and I was targeting to New York always. Sometimes I was dreaming that I have come to New York. Then Bhaktivedanta Swami met Mr. Agarwal, a Mathura's businessman, and mentioned to him in passing, as he did to almost everyone he met, that he wanted to go to the West. Although Mr. Agarwal had known Bhaktivedanta Swami for only a few minutes, he volunteered to try to get him a sponsor in America. It was something Mr. Agarwal had done a number of times when he met a sadhu who mentioned something about going abroad to teach Hindu culture. He would ask his son Gopal, an engineer in Pennsylvania, to send back a sponsorship form. When Mr. Agarwal volunteered to help in this way, Bhaktivedanta Swami urged him, please do it so. Srila Prabhupada said, I did not say anything seriously to Mr. Agarwal, but perhaps he took it very seriously. I asked him, well, why don't you ask your son Gopal to sponsor so that I can go there? I want to preach there. But Bhaktivedanta Swami knew he could not simply dream of going to the West. He needed money. In March 1965, he made another visit to Bombay, attempting to sell his books. Again, he stayed at the free Dharmashala Prem Kutir, but finding customers was difficult. He met Paramananda Bhagwani, a librarian at Jai Hindu College, who purchased books for the college library and then escorted Bhaktivedanta Swami to a few likely outlets. Mr. Bhagwani. I took him to the popular book depot at Grant Road to help him in selling books, but they told us they couldn't stock the books because they don't have much sales on religion. Then he went to another shop nearby, and the owner also regretted his inability to sell the books. Then he went to Sadhuvela near Mahalakshmi temple, and we met the head of the temple there. He of course welcomed us. They have a library of their own and they stock religious books. So we approached them to please keep a set there in their library. They are a wealthy ashram, and yet he also expressed his inability. Bhaktivedanta Swami returned to Delhi, pursuing the usual avenues of book selling and looking for whatever opportunity might arise. And to his surprise, he was contacted by the Ministry of External Affairs and informed that his no objection certificate for going to the US was ready. Since he had not instigated any proceedings for leaving the country, Bhaktivedanta Swami had to inquire from the ministry about what had happened. They showed him the statutory declaration form signed by Mr. Gopal Agarwal of Butler, Pennsylvania. Mr. Agarwal solemnly declared that he would bear the expenses of Bhaktivedanta Swami during his stay in the US. Srila Prabhupada. Whatever the correspondence was there between the father and son, I did not know. I simply asked him, why don't you ask your son Gopal to sponsor? And now, after 3 or 4 months, the no objection certificate was sent from the Indian consulate in New York to me. He had already sponsored my arrival there for 1 month, and all of a sudden I got the paper. At his father's request, Gopal Agarwal had done as he had done for several other sadhus, none of whom had ever gone to America. It was just a formality, something to satisfy his father. Gopal has requested a form from the Indian consulate in New York, obtained a statement from his employer certifying his monthly salary, gotten a letter from his bank showing his balance as of April 1965, and he had the form notarized. It had been stamped and approved in New York and sent to Delhi. Now Bhaktivedanta Swami had a sponsor, but he still needed a passport, visa, P form and travel fare. The passport was not very difficult to obtain. Krishna Pandit helped, and by June 10 he had his passport. Carefully, he penned in his address at Radha Krishna Temple in Chippivada and wrote his father's name Gaur Mohan De. He asked Krishna Pandit also to pay for his going abroad, but Krishna Pandit refused, thinking it against Hindu principles for a sadhu to go abroad and also very expensive. With his passport and sponsorship paper, Bhaktivedanta Swami went to Bombay not to sell books or raise funds for printing. He wanted a ticket for America. Again, he tried approaching Sumita Morarji. He showed his sponsorship papers to her secretary, Mr. Chokshi, who was impressed and who went to Mrs. Morarji on his behalf. The Swami from Vrindavan is back, he told her. He has published his book on your donation. He has a sponsor and he wants to go to America. He wants you to send him on a Scindia ship. Mrs. Morarji said no. The Swamiji was too old to go to the United States and expect to accomplish anything. As Mr. Chokshi conveyed to him Mrs. Morarji's words, Bhaktivedanta Swami listened disapprovingly. She wanted him to stay in India and complete the Srimad Bhagavatam. Why go to the States? Finish the job here. But Bhaktivedanta Swami was fixed on going. He told Mr. Chokshi that he should convince Mrs. Morarji. He coached Mr. Chokshi on what he should say. I find this gentleman very interested to go to the States and preach something to the people there. But when he told Mrs. Morarji, she again said no. The Swami was not healthy. It would be too cold there. He might not be able to come back, and she doubted whether he would be able to accomplish much there. People in America were not so cooperative, and they would probably not listen to him. Exasperated with Mr. Chokshi's ineffectiveness, Bhaktivedanta Swami demanded a personal interview. It was granted, and a grey-haired, determined Bhaktivedanta Swami presented his emphatic request, please give me one ticket. Sumita Morarji was concerned. Swamiji, you are so old. You are taking this responsibility. Do you think it is all right? No, he reassured her, lifting his hand as if to reassure a doubting daughter. It is all right. But do you know what my secretaries think? They say Swamiji is going to die there. Bhaktivedanta made a face as if to dismiss a foolish rumor. Again he insisted that she give him a ticket. All right, she said. Get your P form and I will make an arrangement to send you by our ship. Bhaktivedanta Swami smiled brilliantly and happily left her offices past her amazed and skeptical clerks. A P form, another necessity for an Indian national who wants to leave the country, is a certificate given by the State Bank of India, certifying that the person has no excessive debts in India and is cleared by the banks. That would take a while to obtain, and he also did not yet have a US visa. He needed to pursue these government permissions in Bombay, but he had no place to stay. So Mrs. Morarji agreed to let him reside at Scindia Colony, a compound of apartments for employees of Scindia Company. He stayed in a small, unfurnished apartment with only his trunk and typewriter. The resident Scindia employees all knew that Mrs. Morarji was sending him to the West, and some of them became interested in his cause. They were impressed, for although he was so old, he was going abroad to preach. He was a special sadhu, a scholar. They heard from him how he was taking hundreds of copies of his books with him, but no money. He became a celebrity at Scindia Colony. Various families brought him rice, sabji and fruit. They brought so much that he would not eat it all, and he mentioned this to Mr. Chokshi. Just accept it and distribute it, Mr. Chokshi advised. Bhaktivedanta Swami then began giving remnants of his food to the children. Some of the older residents gathered to hear him as he read and spoke from Srimad Bhagavatam. Mr. Vasavada, the chief cashier of Scindia, was particularly impressed and came regularly to learn from the sadhu. Mr. Vasavada obtained copies of Bhaktivedanta Swami's books and read them in his home. Bhaktivedanta Swami's apartment shared a roofed-in veranda with Mr. Nagarajan, a Scindia office worker, and his wife. Mrs. Nagarajan says, "Every time when I passed that way, he used to be writing or chanting. I would ask him, 'Swamiji, what are you writing?' He used to sit near the window and one after another was translating the Sanskrit. He gave me 2 books and said, 'Child, if you read this book, you will understand.' We would have discourses in the house, and 4 or 5 Gujarati ladies used to come. At one of these discourses, he told one lady that those who wear their hair parted on the side, that is not a good idea. Every Indian lady should have her hair parted in the center. They were very fond of listening and very keen to hear his discourse. Every day he would go out trying to get his visa and P form as quickly as possible, selling his books and seeking contacts and support for his future Srimad Bhagavatam publishing. Mr. Nagarajan tried to help. Using the telephone directory, he made a list of wealthy business and professional men who were Vaishnavas and might be inclined to assist. Bhaktivedanta Swami's neighbors at Scindia colony observed him coming home dead tired in the evening. He would sit quietly, perhaps feeling morose, and some neighbors thought, but after a while he would sit up, regenerated, and start writing. Mrs. Nagarajan. When he came home, we used to give him courage, and we used to tell him, "Swamiji, one day you will achieve your target." He would say, "Time is still not right. Time is still not right. They are all ajnanis. They do not understand. But still I must carry on." Sometimes I would go by and his chadar would be on the chair, but he would be sitting on the window sill. I would ask him, "Swamiji, did you have any good contacts?" He would say, "Not much today. I didn't get much, and it is depressing. Tomorrow Krishna will give me more details." And he would sit there quietly. After 10 minutes, he would sit in his chair and start writing. I would wonder how Swamiji was so tired in 1 minute, and in another minute, even if he was tired, he was not defeated. He would never speak discouragement, and he would always encourage him and say, "If today you don't get it, tomorrow you will definitely meet some people and they will encourage you." And my friends used to come in the morning and in the evening for discourse, and they would take namaskar and fruits. They would give namaskar and fruits. Mr. Nagarajan said, "His temperament was very adjustable and homely. Our friends would offer a few rupees. He would say, 'All right, it will help.' He used to walk from our colony to Andheri station. It is 2 kilometers, and he used to go there without taking a bus because he had no money." Bhaktivedanta Swami had a page printed entitled "My Mission," and he would show it to influential men in his attempts to get further financing for Srimad Bhagavatam. The printed statement proposed that God consciousness was the only remedy for the evils of the modern materialistic society. Despite scientific advancement and material comfort, there was no peace in the world. Therefore, Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, the glory of India, must be spread all over the world. Mrs. Morarji asked Bhaktivedanta Swami if he would read Srimad Bhagavatam to her in the evening. He agreed. She began sending her car for him at 6 o'clock each evening, and then they would sit in her garden, where he would recite and comment on the Bhagavatam. Mr. Morarji. He used to come in the evening and sing the verses in the rhythmic tunes, as if usually done in the Bhagavatam, done with the Bhagavatam. And certain points, when you sit and discuss, you raise so many points. He was commenting on certain points, but it was all from the Bhagavatam. So he used to sit and explain to me and then go. He could give time and I could hear him. That was for about 10 or 15 days. His backing by Scindia and his sponsorship in the US were a strong presentation, and with the help of people at Scindia, he obtained his visa on July 28, 1965. But the P-form proceedings went slow and even threatened to be a last insurmountable obstacle. Srila Prabhupada. Formally, there was no restriction for going outside, but for a sannyasi like me, I had so much difficulty obtaining the government permission to go out. I had applied the P form sanction, but no sanction was coming. Then I went to the State Bank of India. The officer was Mr. Martarchari. He told me, Swamiji, you are sponsored by a private man, so we cannot accept. If you were invited by some institution, then we could consider. But you are invited by a private man for a month, and after a month, if you are in difficulty, there will be so many obstacles. But I had already prepared everything to go, so I said, what have you done? He said, I have decided not to sanction your P form. I said, no, no, don't do this. You better send me to your superior. It should not be like that. So he took my request and he sent the file to Chief Official of Foreign Exchange, something like that. So he was the supreme man in the State Bank of India. I went to see him. I asked his secretary, do you have such and such a file? You kindly put it to Mr. Rao. I want to see him. So the secretary agreed and he put the file and he put my name down to see him. I was waiting. Mr. Rao came personally. He said, Swamiji, I passed your case. Don't worry. Following Mrs. Morarji's instruction, her secretary, Mr. Chokshi, made final arrangements for Bhaktivedanta Swami. Since he had no warm clothes, Mr. Chokshi took him to buy a wool jacket and other woolen clothes. Mr. Chokshi spent about Rs 250 on new clothes, including some new dhotis. At Bhaktivedanta Swami's request, Mr. Chokshi printed 500 copies of a small pamphlets containing the 8 verses written by Lord Chaitanya and an advertisement for Srimad Bhagavatam in the context of an advertisement for the Scindia Steamship Company. Mr. Chokshi, I asked him, why couldn't you go earlier? Why do you want to go now to States at this age? He replied, I will be able to do something good, I am sure. His idea was that someone should be there who would be able to go near people who were lost in life and teach them and tell them what the correct thing is. I asked him so many times, why do you want to go to the States? Why don't you start something in Bombay or Delhi or Vrindavan? I was teasing him also. You are interested in seeing the States, therefore you want to go? All Swamijis want to go to the States and you want to enjoy there? He said, what I have got to see, I have finished my life. But sometimes he was hot-tempered. He used to get angry at me for the delays. What is this nonsense? He would say. Then I would understand, he is getting angry now. Sometimes he would say, oh, Mrs. Morarji has still not signed this paper. She says, come back tomorrow. We will talk tomorrow. What is this? Why this daily going back? He would get angry. Then I would say, you can sit here. But he would say, how long do I have to sit? He would become impatient. Finally, Mrs. Morarji scheduled a place for him on one of her ships, the Jaladuta, which was sailing from Calcutta on August 13. She had made certain that he would travel on a ship whose captain understood the needs of a vegetarian and a Brahmana. Mrs. Morarji told the Jaladuta captain Arun Pandya to carry extra vegetables and fruits for the Swami. Mr. Chokshi spent the last 2 days with Bhaktivedanta Swami in Bombay, picking up the pamphlets at the press, purchasing clothes, and driving him to the station to catch the train for Calcutta. He arrived in Calcutta about 2 weeks before the Jaladuta departure. Although he had lived much of his life in the city, he now had nowhere to stay. It was as he had written in his Vrindavan bhajan. I have my wife, sons, daughters, grandsons, everything, but I have no money. so they are a fruitless glory. Although in the city he had been so carefully nurtured as a child, those early days were also gone forever. Where have my loving father and mother gone to now? And where are my elders who were my own folk? Who will give me news of them? Tell me who. All that is left of this family life is a list of names. Out of hundreds of people in Calcutta whom Bhaktivedanta Swami knew, he chose to call on Mrs. Sisir Bhattacharya, the flamboyant Kirtan singer he had met a year before at Governor's house in Lucknow. Mr. Bhattacharya was not a relative, not a disciple, not even a close friend, but he was willing to help. Bhaktivedanta Swami called at his place and informed him that he would be leaving on a cargo ship in a few days. He needed a place to stay and he would like to give some lectures. Mr. Bhattacharya immediately began to arrange a few private meetings at friends' homes where he would sing and Bhakti Vedanta Swami would then speak. Mr. Bhattacharya thought that thought the sadhus leaving for America should make an important news story. He accompanied Bhaktivedanta Swami to all the newspapers in Calcutta, the Hindustan Standard, Amrita Bazar Patrika, the Jugantas, the Statesman, and others. Bhaktivedanta Swami had only one photograph, a passport photo, and they made a few copies of that for the newspapers. Mr. Bhattacharya would try to explain what the Swami was going to do, and the news writers would listen. But none of them wrote anything. Finally, they visited the Dainik Basmati, a local Bengali daily, which agreed to print a small article with Bhaktivedanta Swami picture. A week before his departure, on August 6, Bhaktivedanta Swami traveled to nearby Mayapur to visit the Samadhi of Śrīla Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. Then he returned to Calcutta, where Mr. Bhattacharya continued to assist him with his final business and speaking engagements. Mr. Bhattacharya said, "We just took a hired taxi to this place and that place, and he would go for preaching. I never talked to him during the preaching, but once when I was coming back from the preaching, I said, 'You said this thing about this, but I tell you it is not this, it is this.' I crossed him in something or argued, and he was furious. Whenever we argued and I said, 'No, I think this is this,' then he was shouting. He was very furious. He said, 'You are always saying, I think, I think, I think. What is the importance of what you think? Everything is what you think, but it doesn't matter. It matters what Shastra says. You must follow.' I said, go, I must do what I think, what I feel. That is important." He said, "No, you should forget this. You should forget your desire. You should change your habits. Better you depend on Shastras. You follow what Shastras want you to do and do it. I am not telling you what I think, but I am repeating what the Shastras say." As the day of his departure approached, Bhaktivedanta Swami took stock of his meager possessions. He had only a suitcase, an umbrella, and a supply of dry cereal. He did not know what he would find to eat in America. Perhaps there would be only meat. If so, he was prepared to live on boiled potatoes and cereal. His main baggage, several trucks of his books, was being handled separately by Scindia Cargo. 203-volume sets. The very thought of the books gave him confidence. When the day came for him to leave, he needed that confidence. He was making a momentous break with his previous life, and he was dangerously old and not in strong health, and he was going to an unknown and probably unwelcoming country. To be poor and unknown in India was one thing. Even in these Kali Yuga days, when India's leaders were rejecting Vedic culture and imitating the West, it was still India. It was still the remains of Vedic civilization. He had been able to see millionaires, governors, and the prime ministers simply by showing up at their doors and waiting. A sannyasi was respected. The Srimad Bhagavatam was respected. But in America, it would be different. He would be no one, a foreigner, and there was no India, no tradition of sadhu, no temples, no free ashrams. But when he thought of the books he was bringing, the transcendental knowledge in English, he became confident. When he met someone in America, he would give him a flyer, Srimad Bhagavatam, India's message of peace and goodwill. It was August 13, just a few days before Janmashtami, the appearance day anniversary of Lord Krishna. The next day would be his own 69th birthday. During these last years, he had been in Vrindavan for Janmashtami. Many Vrindavan residents would never leave there. They were old and at peace in Vrindavan. Bhaktivedanta Swami was also concerned that he might die away from Vrindavan. That was why all the Vaishnava sadhus and widows had taken vows not to leave even for Mathura, because to die in Vrindavan was the perfection of life. And the Hindu tradition was that a sannyasi should not cross the ocean and go to the land of mlechas. But beyond all that was the desire of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and his desire was not different from the from that of Lord Krishna. And the Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had predicted that the chanting of Hare Krishna would be known in every town and village of the world. Bhaktivedanta Swami took a taxi down to the Calcutta port. A few friends and admirers, along with his son Vrindavan, accompanied him. He writes in his diary, "Today at 9 a.m. embarked on MV Jaladuta, came with me Bhagwati, the Dwarvan of Scindia Sansir, Mr. Sen Gupta, Mr. Ali and Vrindavan." He was carrying a Bengali copy of Chaitanya Charitamrita which he intended to read during the crossing. Somehow he would be able to cook on board, or if not, he could starve, whatever Krishna desired. He checked his essentials, passenger ticket, passport, visa, P form, sponsor's address. Finally, it was happening. Srila Prabhupada, with what great difficulty I got out of the country. Some way or the other, by Krishna's grace, I got out so I could spread the Krishna consciousness movement all over the world. Otherwise, to remain in India, it was not possible. I wanted to start a movement in India, but I was not at all encouraged. The black cargo ship, small and weathered, was moored at dockside, a gangway leading from the dock to the ship's deck. Indian merchant sellers curiously eyed the elderly saffron-dressed sadhu as he spoke last words to his companions and then left them, and walked determinedly toward the boat. For thousands of years, Krishna Bhakti had been known only in India, not outside, except in twisted, faithless reports by foreigners. And the only Swamis to have reached America had been non-devotees, Mayavad impersonalists. But now Krishna was sending Bhaktivedanta Swami as his emissary. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Thank you, Prabhuji, for
Hare
this nice
Krishna.
narration. Yeah. We see, Prabhuji, that at that time, so many people, I mean, many ministers were very religious and were ready to help sannyasi sadhu. So at that time,
Hmm.
yeah, it was nice atmosphere, I think, that time.
Yeah.
And Prabhuji, what was the reason that people were not happy that a sadhu should cross the country? Was there any specific reason mentioned in Shastra that a sadhu should not cross the country to go to a
Yeah.
place outside?
Yeah, I mean, it is said that one who crosses over, because it is like maybe one associates with the non-devotees, right? So there is a possibility that they get corrupted. Yeah, so in that way they get polluted. Yeah, because other countries there is no culture, and one who doesn't we know, right? Sadhu Sangh is so important, and if a sadhu, uh, he is, if someone such a, it was like a Brahmanism, which is purity. One cannot maintain outside the, Vedic uh, environment. So that's why it was said that one goes there, then they spoil. Krishna.
Yes, okay. So is it also mentioned in any Shastra also? Also referred, or
Yeah.
is it
I mean, I
just
heard, but I'll find in which shastras it is referred.
okay? Okay, Prabhuji. Yeah. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Wonderful chapter. We are waiting when Prabhupada start to America. So finally today it's
Yeah.
out of step is happen. And finally he got the key form and everything. Yeah. For every step he has a still, but still Prabhupada was so strong.
Yeah, I don't know if your voice is breaking only for me or everyone else.
Yes, for me also it was breaking. Yeah.
Okay, my network issue, Prabhuji.
Yeah.
Sorry, Prabhuji. Yeah.
But I got it. You are saying like, looking forward for US Yatra.
Yes, today's lecture was full of suspense. What will happen? What will happen? It was very nice. Yeah. What Mataji also said. Very happy to know that Prabhuji got the ticket, and yeah, ready to go.
Every time it's but today success.
Yes.
That's the glories of the of a Vaishnava who has dedicated his life for his spiritual master. Yep. Okay. Thank you very much, and looking forward for many more um, impressions to deepen our faith at the lotus feet of Srila Prabhupada. Then Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyeva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. His Holiness Sattva Swarupa Goswami Maharaj ki jai. And the Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Hare Krishna.